They thought she'd crumble the moment they pushed her too far. 4 senior athletes, town heroes with million-dollar smiles and parents who owned half the businesses on Main Street, cornering one quiet English teacher in an empty gymnasium. They'd done this before, watched grown adults beg, plead, and eventually crawl when the pressure became too much. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't just any teacher. She was someone who'd learned to fight in places where surrender meant death, who'd traded desert combat boots for classroom heels, and who'd spent 6 years watching people's backs in Afghanistan before deciding to shape young minds in Colorado. When they tried to break her that October evening, demanding she get on her knees and crawl across the gym floor like the worthless nobody they thought she was, they had no idea they were about to meet a woman who'd survived roadside bombs, treated wounded soldiers under fire, and earned her stripes in ways these privileged teenagers couldn't begin to imagine. What happened next didn't just shock everyone in Westfield High School. It changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Rocky Mountain foothills like cigarette smoke, and Sarah Mitchell sat in her dented Honda Civic outside Westfield High School, watching teenagers stream through the front doors with the casual confidence of young kings and queens. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles white against the black leather. Through the windshield, she could see the sprawling brick complex that would be her new battlefield, though she'd never used that word out loud. Battlefield was her old life. This was supposed to be her sanctuary. At 28, Sarah had the kind of quiet presence that made people look twice. Not because she was particularly striking, though her dark hair and steady brown eyes had turned heads in her small hometown of Cedar Falls. It was something else, something in the way she held herself, spine straight and shoulders square, like she was perpetually at attention even in civilian clothes. Her teaching certificate was still crisp in her briefcase, earned during late nights at Colorado State University, while she worked through the transition from Army medic to high school. English teacher. 2 years of college classes, student teaching, and therapy sessions to help her process the memories that still woke her at 3 a.m. The job posting had been straightforward. Westfield High School, enrollment 1200, seeking English teacher. For immediate start. Good benefits, competitive salary, and a chance to make a difference in young lives. What they hadn't mentioned was that Westfield was the kind of place where high school football games drew bigger crowds than the county fair, where the starting quarterback's name appeared on more scholarship banners than honor roll lists, and where certain families had been making generous donations to the school district for so long that their influence ran deeper than the foundation. Sarah adjusted her rearview mirror and caught sight of her own reflection. She'd chosen her outfit carefully that morning, a navy blue blazer over a white blouse, professional but not intimidating. Her military dog tags hung beneath the collar, hidden but present, a reminder of who she'd been before she decided to become someone else. The transition had been her therapist's idea. "You've spent 6 years taking care of people in crisis," Dr. Patricia Reeves had said during one of their sessions. "Maybe it's time to help people before they reach that point." The first bell rang, a sharp electronic sound that cut through the morning air. Sarah gathered her briefcase and the cardboard box containing her personal items for the classroom. A small American flag, a photo of her unit from her deployment, and a coffee mug with "World's Okayest Teacher" printed on the side, a gift from her younger sister who'd insisted she needed to develop a sense of humor about her new career. She locked her car and walked toward the building, her sensible flats clicking against the asphalt with military precision. The hallways of Westfield High smelled like floor cleaner and teenage ambition. Trophy cases lined the walls, filled with decades of athletic achievements. State championships in football, wrestling, basketball. Academic awards were there too, but they occupied the smaller cases, the ones tucked into corners where visitors might miss them. Sarah found her way to the main office, where a secretary with silver hair and kind eyes checked her name against a list. Sarah Mitchell, right on time, the woman said, extending her hand. I'm Mrs. Patterson. Welcome to Westfield. Principal Hayes is running a few minutes late, but he'll be with you shortly. Sarah shook her hand and took a seat in the waiting area. Around her, the controlled chaos of a school day beginning played out. Students stopping by to turn in forms, teachers grabbing coffee and making copies, the athletic director discussing practice schedules with someone on the phone. It felt familiar and foreign at the same time, like visiting a place she'd seen in photographs but never experienced. Miss Mitchell? A man in his 50s appeared in the doorway, wearing a tie. That suggested he'd gotten dressed in a hurry. Robert Hayes, principal. Sorry to keep you waiting. Principal Hayes had the look of someone who'd spent his career trying to keep everyone happy and succeeding most of the time. His office was filled with photographs of school events, handshake, pictures with local dignitaries, and a collection of coffee mugs from various educational conferences. He gestured for Sarah to sit across from his desk and pulled out a folder with her name on it. I have to say, your application was impressive, he began, flipping through pages. Military service, strong academic record, excellent references from your student teaching. We're lucky to have you. Sarah nodded, waiting for the inevitable questions about her transition from military to civilian life. Instead, Hayes leaned forward with the expression of someone sharing a confidence. I want to be honest with you about something, he said. Westfield is a great school, but we do have some challenges. Our student body comes from diverse backgrounds, and sometimes that creates tension. We've had 3 English teachers in the past 2 years, and I'd be lying if I said it was entirely due to budget cuts. What kind of challenges? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. Hayes hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Some of our students, particularly those involved in athletics, can be testing. They're used to a certain level of attention and accommodation. Previous teachers have sometimes found it difficult to maintain classroom discipline with students who are, shall we say, prominent members of the community. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. She'd dealt with difficult personalities before, though in her previous job they'd usually been carrying weapons and questioning her authority in life-or-death situations. High school students seemed manageable by comparison. I understand, she said. I'm confident I can handle whatever comes up. Haas smiled, the relief evident on his face. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. Let me show you to your classroom. Room 204 was at the end of the second-floor hallway, with tall windows that looked out over the student parking lot. Sarah could see the clear hierarchy even from above. The spaces closest to the building were occupied by trucks and SUVs that cost more than most people's annual salaries, while the older, more practical vehicles were relegated to the far corners. Her own Honda sat in the teacher's section, looking modest but dignified among the other faculty cars. The classroom itself was standard issue. 30 desks arranged in rows, a whiteboard at the front, and bulletin boards that the previous teacher had left partially decorated. Sarah set her box on the desk and began the process of making the space her own. She arranged the few personal items she'd brought, conscious of not wanting to reveal too much about herself too quickly. The flag went on a shelf where students could see it, but wouldn't feel compelled to ask questions. The unit photo stayed in the box for now. Her first class of the day was Senior English, and they arrived with the casual confidence of people who'd been ruling their small kingdom for 4 years. Sarah watched them filter in, noting the natural groupings and hierarchies. The athletes sat together, their leather jackets draped over their chairs like badges of honor. The academic achievers claimed the front rows, notebooks already open, and pens ready. The social butterflies scattered throughout the room, maintaining their complex web of relationships through meaningful glances and subtle gestures. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Good morning," Sarah said, standing in front of the whiteboard. "I'm Miss Mitchell, and I'll be your English teacher for the remainder of the semester." The room was quiet, but not the respectful quiet of students ready to learn. It was the watchful quiet of predators sizing up potential prey. Sarah recognized it immediately. She'd seen the same expression on the faces of soldiers testing new commanders, probing for weakness, looking for signs that authority could be challenged. "I know you're probably wondering about Mrs. Henderson," Sarah continued, referring to the teacher who'd left mid-semester. "I'm sure you'll find that my teaching style is somewhat different. I believe in treating you as the adults you're becoming, which means I expect adult behavior and adult effort." A hand shot up from the back of the room. Sarah looked at the boy who'd raised it, noting the confident smile and the way other students seemed to defer to him. He was tall, with the kind of athletic build that suggested hours in the weight room, and he wore his leather jacket despite the warm October weather. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of being listened to. "I'm Jake Harrison. My dad's on the school board, and he wanted me to ask how you plan to handle the fact that we're behind in the curriculum because of all the teacher changes." Sarah studied Jake for a moment, recognizing the challenge hidden in what sounded like a reasonable question. Around him, other students were watching carefully, waiting to see how she'd respond. This was her first test, and everyone in the room knew it. "That's a fair question, Jake," she said, her voice steady and professional. "I've reviewed the curriculum and your previous assignments. We'll be able to catch up without compromising the quality of your education. I assume that's what your father would want." Jake's smile faltered slightly, but he nodded. "Of course. We just want to make sure we're prepared for college." "I'm sure you do," Sarah replied. "Now let's talk about your current assignment. You're supposed to be working on persuasive essays. I'd like to see how you're approaching the topic of personal responsibility." The class proceeded without further incident, but Sarah could feel the undercurrent of tension. Jake and his friends, a group that included Marcus Webb from the wrestling team and Tyler Brooks from soccer, exchanged glances throughout the lesson. They were planning something, testing boundaries, deciding how far they could push before she'd push back. During lunch, Sarah sat in the teacher's lounge with Lisa Chun, a math teacher who'd been at Westfield for 3 years. Lisa had offered to show her the ropes, and Sarah was grateful for the friendly face. "So how was your first morning?" Lisa asked, unwrapping a sandwich. "Interesting," Sarah replied. "I had Jake Harrison in my first class." Lisa's expression grew more serious. "Ah, you've met our local celebrity. He seems to have quite a bit of influence for a 17-year-old. "That's putting it mildly," Lisa said. "His father owns Harrison Motors, the biggest car dealership in 3 counties. They've donated enough money to this school to have a building named after them. Jake's been the starting quarterback since his sophomore year, and he's got a full ride to Colorado State next fall." Sarah absorbed this information, filing it away with her other observations. "What about the other boys he sits with?" "Marcus Webb, Tyler Brooks, and Derek Stone. They call themselves the Core Four, though most of the teachers have less flattering names for them. They're all headed to college on athletic scholarships, all from wealthy families, and all used to getting their way." "Have they given you any trouble?" Lisa hesitated, then lowered her voice. "They don't bother with math teachers as much. It's harder to argue with equations. But they've made life difficult for several English and social studies teachers over the years. They have ways of making you feel like you're not welcome." "What kind of ways?" "Small things at first. Challenging everything you say, disrupting class discussions, turning in assignments late, and expecting you to accept them without Penalty. If that doesn't work, they escalate. Complaints to parents, accusations of unfair treatment, social media campaigns. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. And the administration? Principal Hayes tries to be fair, but he's under a lot of pressure. These boys' parents have significant influence, and they're not shy about using it. The last English teacher, Mrs. Henderson, left after Jake's father accused her of being biased against student athletes and threatened to have her fired. Was she? She was one of the best teachers I've ever worked with, Lisa said quietly. She just refused to give Jake a passing grade on an essay he clearly didn't write himself. Sarah finished her sandwich in thoughtful silence. She'd faced down insurgents and treated wounded soldiers in hostile territory, but this was a different kind of warfare. The rules were more complex, the battle lines less clear, and the consequences potentially just as devastating to innocent people. Afternoon brought her first real confrontation. Jake and his friends had apparently decided to test her boundaries during fifth period, the class right after lunch when teenagers were at their most restless. It started small. Marcus Webb made a comment about military people being too rigid for teaching. Tyler Brooks questioned whether someone without children could really understand teenagers. Derek Stone simply stared at her with undisguised contempt. Sarah handled each provocation with professional calm, redirecting the conversation back to the lesson and refusing to take the bait. But she could see the frustration building in their faces. They were used to getting reactions, to pushing buttons until teachers snapped and gave them ammunition for complaints. The breakthrough came during a discussion of To Kill a Mockingbird. Sarah had assigned the class to analyze the theme of moral courage, and she'd called on Jake to share his thoughts. I think the whole book is outdated, Jake said, leaning back in his chair. I mean, why are we still reading about stuff that happened like 100 years ago? It's not relevant to our lives. What makes you think it's not relevant? Sarah asked, Come on, Miss Mitchell. We don't have segregation anymore. Racism is basically over. This book just makes people feel guilty about stuff they didn't do. Sarah felt a familiar calm descend over her, the same stillness she'd experienced in combat zones when the situation required absolute precision. She'd heard similar arguments before, usually from people who'd never experienced real hardship or witnessed genuine injustice. You're right that legal segregation has ended, she said. But the book isn't just about legal systems. It's about the courage it takes to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult or unpopular. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between doing the right thing and doing the easy thing? Jake's confident smile wavered. Slightly, I guess. Can you give us an example? The classroom fell silent. Other students sensed the shift in dynamic, the way the conversation had suddenly become more serious. Jake looked around at his friends, then back at Sarah. I don't know. Like, if you saw someone cheating on a test, you'd have to decide whether to tell the teacher or mind your own business. Exactly, Sarah said. And what would you do in that situation? Jake hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. I'd probably mind my own business. It's not my problem. But what if the person cheating was taking a spot in a college program that someone else deserved? What if their dishonesty affected other people? That's different, Jake said, his voice rising slightly. That's not the same thing. Huh? Is it different? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jake's face flushed, and Sarah could see the anger building behind his eyes. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone he'd already decided was beneath him. It just is, he said finally. You don't understand what it's like here. You don't know how things work. Sarah nodded slowly. You're right. I don't know how things work here. But I know how things should work. And I know that moral courage isn't about understanding local customs. It's about doing what's right regardless of the consequences. The bell rang, ending the class, but the tension remained. Students filed out quietly, sensing they'd witnessed something significant. Jake and his friends were the last to leave, and as they passed Sarah's desk, Jake paused. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I think you're going to find that Westfield is more complicated than you realize." Sarah looked up at him, her expression calm but alert. "I'm sure it is, Jake, but complicated doesn't mean impossible to navigate." After the classroom emptied, Sarah sat at her desk for a long moment, processing what had just happened. She'd established a line, made it clear that she wouldn't be intimidated or manipulated. But she'd also painted a target on her back. In her military experience, that usually meant the real fight was about to begin. She gathered her things and headed for the parking lot, planning to spend the evening reviewing lesson plans and preparing for tomorrow's classes. But as she walked through the hallways, she noticed the looks. Students whispering to each other, glancing in her direction, then quickly looking away. Word traveled fast in a small school, and apparently her confrontation with Jake had become the topic of conversation. Her Honda sat alone in the teacher's parking section, most of the other faculty having left for the day. Sarah was fishing for her keys when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Jake Harrison approaching, flanked by Marcus Tyler and Derek. They'd changed out of their school clothes and into casual wear, but they still carried themselves with the confidence of people who'd never been told no. "Miss Mitchell," Jake said, stopping a few feet away, "I wanted to apologize for earlier. I think we got off on the wrong foot." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of genuine remorse. Instead, she saw the practiced sincerity of someone who'd learned to manipulate adults through charm and apparent vulnerability. Behind him, his friends watched with barely concealed amusement. "Apology accepted," she said simply, not taking the bait. "The thing is," Jake continued, "I don't think you understand how things work around here. The teachers who do well at Westfield are the ones who work with us, not against us. We're not your enemy." "I don't have enemies," Sarah replied. "I have students." Marcus stepped forward, his wrestler's build making him appear more threatening than Jake's quarterback frame. "Look, lady, we're trying to be nice here. But you need to understand that we have influence in this town. Our parents pay your salary." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. Anyone who'd served with her in Afghanistan would have recognized the subtle signs. The way her weight shifted to the balls of her feet. The way her hands relaxed at her sides. The way her breathing became deeper and more controlled. "Is that a threat?" she asked quietly. Tyler laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "It's not a threat. It's just reality. Ask Mrs. Henderson. Ask Mr. Peterson from last year. Ask any of the teachers who tried to go to war with us." "I'm not going to war with anyone," Sarah said. "I'm here to teach." "Then we understand each other," Jake said, his smile returning. "As long as you remember that we're the ones who matter in this school, we'll get along fine." They walked away, leaving Sarah standing alone beside her car. She watched them go, noting the way they moved together, the casual cruelty in their laughter, the absolute certainty that they were untouchable. She'd seen that kind of arrogance before, in soldiers who thought their rank or connections made them invulnerable. It never ended well. Sarah drove home through the quiet streets of Westfield, passing the well-maintained houses and perfect lawns that spoke of prosperity and security. But she'd learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving, that sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones who smiled while they sharpened their knives. Her apartment was small but comfortable, a one-bedroom place near the community college where she'd finished her teaching degree. She made herself dinner, graded papers, and tried to focus on the lesson plans for tomorrow. But her mind kept drifting. Back to the confrontation in the parking lot, to the casual threats and the assumption that she could be intimidated. Before going to bed, Sarah opened the cardboard box she'd brought from school and pulled out the photograph of her unit. 12 soldiers, including herself, taken during a brief respite between missions. Half of them hadn't made it home. The ones who had carried scars that would never fully heal. Looking at their faces, Sarah felt the familiar weight of survivor's guilt. The question that had haunted her for years: why had she been spared when better people had died? Dr. Reeves had helped her understand that survival wasn't random, that she'd been given a chance to honor her fallen comrades by living a life of purpose and meaning. Teaching was supposed to be that purpose, a way to shape young minds and prevent the kind of thinking that led to violence and hatred. But as she turned off the lights and settled into bed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her biggest battles were still ahead of her. Jake Harrison and his friends had made their intentions clear. They wanted her to submit, to accept their version of reality and teach within the boundaries they set. They'd broken previous teachers through intimidation and manipulation, and they expected her to fall in line. What they didn't understand was that Sarah Mitchell had been broken before, in ways that made high school bullies seem like minor inconveniences. She'd been rebuilt stronger, tempered by experiences that had taught her the difference between real threats and empty bluster. She'd learned to function under pressure, to make life and death decisions with incomplete information, and to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts to test her resolve. But tonight, Sarah slept the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who'd found their mission and was prepared to see it through, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. The second week at Westfield High School brought autumn's first real bite to the Colorado air, and with it, an escalation in the silent war being waged in the hallways. Sarah Mitchell arrived each morning to find small acts of sabotage waiting for her. Her classroom door handle sticky with what appeared to be honey. Her parking space mysteriously occupied by orange traffic cones. Her name spelled incorrectly on the faculty bulletin board, changed from Mitchell to miserable in careful block letters that matched Jake Harrison's handwriting from his essay submissions. Each incident was minor enough to dismiss as coincidence or teenage prank, but together they formed a pattern that Sarah recognized from her military training. Psychological warfare, designed to create stress and paranoia while maintaining plausible deniability. She documented each occurrence in a small notebook, photographing the evidence with her phone before cleaning up the mess. If this escalated to official complaints, she wanted records. The real campaign began during her third week, when Sarah discovered that her carefully planned lesson on the crucible had been derailed by a coordinated effort among Jake's group. Marcus Webb had submitted a paper that was clearly plagiarized from an online source, complete with hyperlinks that he'd forgotten to remove. When Sarah returned it with a failing grade and a note about academic integrity, Marcus's father called Principal Hayes within hours. "I've received a complaint from David Webb," Hayes said, closing his office door behind Sarah. "He says you're targeting his son because of his association with Jake Harrison." Sarah set her grade book on Hayes's desk and opened it to Marcus's page. His essay was copied word for word from SparkNotes. "You can verify this yourself." Hayes looked at the evidence, his expression growing more uncomfortable. "I'm not questioning your assessment, but Mr. Webb is claiming that you have a personal vendetta against student athletes." "Based on what?" "He says you've been singling out Jake's friends for criticism, making them feel unwelcome in your classroom." Sarah studied Hayes's face, noting the way he avoided direct eye contact. "Have you received similar complaints from other parents?" "Not yet, but I suspect we will." "Principal Hayes, I've been teaching for exactly 3 weeks. Every grade I've given has been based on clearly defined rubrics that I provided to students in advance. If parents want to challenge my grading, they're welcome to review the assignments and the criteria." Hayes shifted in his chair. "I'm not asking you to change your standards. I'm asking you to be aware of the political realities of this position. These families have significant influence in the community. Are you telling me to pass students who haven't earned it?" I'm telling you to pick your battles carefully. Sarah left the meeting with a clear understanding of the rules of engagement. She was expected to maintain her professional standards while navigating a minefield of parental influence and administrative pressure. It was a familiar situation, though in Afghanistan the stakes had been measured in lives rather than test scores. The next phase of the campaign was more sophisticated. Tyler Brooks began recording their class discussions on his phone, claiming he wanted to review the material later. When Sarah asked him to put the device away, he produced a letter from his mother requesting that he be allowed to record lessons due to a learning disability that required special accommodations. I wasn't aware you had a documented learning disability, Sarah said, examining the letter. It's newly diagnosed, Tyler replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Audio processing disorder. My mom talked to the special education coordinator about it. Sarah recognized the trap. If she denied the accommodation, she'd be accused of discrimination. If she allowed it, everything she said would be scrutinized and potentially taken out of context. She chose a middle path, agreeing to the recording while making sure her lessons were so thoroughly professional that no reasonable person could find fault with them. The psychological pressure intensified when Derek Stone began asking pointed questions about Sarah's military service. How many people had she killed? Did she have PTSD? Was she on medication? Each query was framed as innocent curiosity, but Sarah recognized the fishing expedition. They were looking for ammunition, something they could use to paint her as unstable or dangerous. I served my country honorably, Sarah said when Derek asked about her combat experience. My military record is exemplary, and my transition to civilian life has been successful. If you're interested in learning more about military service, I'd be happy to recommend some excellent books on the subject. But you were in Afghanistan, right? Derek persisted. That must have been pretty intense. Many veterans have served overseas, Sarah replied. We're proud of our service, and we're capable of contributing to our communities in meaningful ways. The questions continued for several days, each one designed to probe for weakness or instability. Sarah answered them with practiced calm, refusing to be drawn into discussions that could be twisted against her. But she could see the frustration building in their faces. They were used to getting reactions, to pushing people until they snapped. The campaign reached a new level when Sarah arrived at school one morning to find her classroom completely rearranged. Every desk had been moved, her bulletin boards had been stripped bare, and someone had written "Welcome Home, Soldier" on the whiteboard in red marker that wouldn't easily erase. It had taken hours of work, accomplished by someone with access to the building after hours. Sarah spent her planning period putting everything back in order, noting that whoever had done this had been careful not to damage anything. It was harassment, not vandalism, designed to send a message without crossing legal lines. She photographed the scene before cleaning up, adding the images to her growing collection of evidence. Lisa Chun found her during lunch, looking concerned. I heard about your classroom. Are you okay? I'm fine, Sarah said, unwrapping her sandwich with steady hands. Just some students expressing their creativity. This is getting out of hand. You should talk to Principal Hayes and tell him what? That someone rearranged my furniture. They didn't damage anything. They didn't steal anything. They just moved some desks around. Lisa lowered her voice. Everyone knows who's doing this. Jake and his friends have been bragging about making you quit before Halloween. Sarah looked up from her lunch. They said that. Not directly, but word gets around. They're taking bets on how long you'll last. What are the odds? Most people think you'll be gone by Thanksgiving. Sarah considered this information while finishing her sandwich. In Afghanistan, she'd learned that the best response to psychological warfare was to remain calm and professional while quietly gathering intelligence. Her tormentors were getting sloppy, overconfident in their ability to intimidate her. That could work to her advantage. The next escalation came during fourth period, when Jake Harrison challenged her directly in front of the entire class. They were discussing Lord of the Flies, and Sarah had asked the students to consider how civilization breaks down when authority is questioned. But what if the authority is wrong? Jake asked, his voice carrying clearly through the room. What if the people in charge don't deserve respect? That's an excellent question, Sarah replied. What do you think determines whether authority is legitimate? Results, Jake said confidently. If someone can't do their job, they shouldn't be in charge. And who decides whether someone can do their job? The people who have to live with the consequences. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. So you're saying that authority should be based on competence and consensus? Exactly. If someone comes into a situation and tries to change things without understanding how they work, they're going to fail. The classroom had gone completely silent. Other students sensed the subtext, the way the conversation had become a direct challenge to Sarah's authority. She could feel their eyes moving between her and Jake, waiting to see how she'd respond. That's a very mature perspective, Sarah said calmly. It suggests that leaders should earn their positions through demonstrated ability rather than inherited privilege. Jake's confident smile faltered slightly. I didn't say anything about inherited privilege. No, but you implied that competence matters more than position. That's a very democratic idea. It suggests that someone's background or family connections shouldn't automatically make them a leader. That's not what I meant. What did you mean? Jake looked around the room, realizing that the conversation had turned against him. I meant that people should prove themselves before they expect others to follow them. I agree completely, Sarah said. Actions speak louder than words. Character matters more than reputation. And true leaders don't need to tear others down to build themselves up. The bell rang, ending the class, but the tension remained. Students filed out quietly, and Sarah could see them whispering to each other in the hallway. Jake and his friends were the last to leave, and as they passed her desk, Jake paused. You think you're clever, he said quietly, making sure only she could hear. But you have no idea what you're getting into. I know exactly what I'm getting into, Sarah replied, her voice equally quiet. The question is whether you do. That afternoon, Sarah stayed late to grade papers and prepare for the next day's lessons. The building was mostly empty, with only the custodial staff and a few teachers working in their classrooms. She was deep in concentration when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her room. The door opened without a knock, and Jake Harrison walked in, followed by Marcus Tyler and Derek. They'd changed out of their school clothes and into casual wear, but they still carried themselves with the casual arrogance that had become their signature. Miss Mitchell, Jake said, closing the door behind him. We need to talk. Sarah looked up from her papers, her expression calm but alert. My office hours are tomorrow morning. You can schedule appointments through the main office. This can't wait, Marcus said, moving to block the door. We've been patient, but you're not getting the message. Sarah set down her pen and faced them directly. What message is that? That you don't belong here, Tyler said. That you're making things difficult for everyone. That you need to find another job, Derek added. Sarah studied their faces, noting the way they'd positioned themselves around the room. It was a classic intimidation tactic, surrounding the target and using physical presence to create psychological pressure. She'd seen it used by interrogators and bullies, and she knew how to respond. Are you threatening me? She asked calmly. We're trying to help you, Jake said. Before this gets worse. Worse how? Jake smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You're a veteran, right? You must know how rumors spread. How people start to wonder if someone with your background is really stable enough to be around children. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. Are you planning to spread rumors about me? We don't need to plan anything, Marcus said. People are already talking. About your military service, about why you really left the army, about whether someone with PTSD should be teaching impressionable teenagers. I don't have PTSD, Sarah said quietly. How would we know? Tyler asked. You could be hiding it. Veterans sometimes snap without warning. That's a dangerous stereotype, Sarah replied. And it's not accurate. Maybe not, Jake said. But it doesn't matter what's true. It matters what people believe. Sarah stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. I think this conversation is over. It's over when we say it's over, Derek said, stepping closer. Sarah looked at each of them in turn, her expression calm but alert. You're making a mistake. The only mistake, Jake said, is thinking you can come into our school and change things. This is our territory. We decide who belongs and who doesn't. And you've decided I don't belong? We've decided you have two choices, Marcus said. You can quit quietly, or we can make your life so miserable that you'll have to quit. Sarah picked up her briefcase and walked toward the door. Marcus stepped aside at the last moment, but not before making it clear that he could have blocked her path if he'd chosen to. Think about what we said, Jake called after her. This is your last chance to do this the easy way. Sarah walked down the empty hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She'd been threatened before, by people far more dangerous than high school students. But this was different. In Afghanistan, the rules of engagement had been clear. Here, she was bound by professional standards and legal constraints that made direct confrontation impossible. She reached her car and sat in the driver's seat for a moment, processing what had just happened. The confrontation had crossed a line from harassment to intimidation. They'd made specific threats about her reputation and her career, and they'd done it in a way that suggested they had the power to follow through. Sarah started her car and drove home through the quiet streets of Westfield. The town looked peaceful in the fading light, with families gathering for dinner and children playing in well-maintained yards. But she'd learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving, that sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones who hid behind smiles and social respectability. Her apartment felt smaller than usual that night, as if the walls were closing in. Sarah made herself dinner, but found she had no appetite. She tried to grade papers but couldn't concentrate. Finally, she called her sister in Denver. Sarah. Jenny's voice was bright with surprise. How's the new job going? It's challenging, Sarah said carefully. Good challenging or bad challenging? Sarah hesitated. Jenny had been supportive throughout her transition from military to civilian life, but she'd also worried about Sarah's ability to adapt to a less structured environment. Some students are testing boundaries. That's normal, isn't it? I mean, they're teenagers. Yes, it's normal. You sound tired. Are you sleeping? Sarah looked at her reflection in the dark window, noting the tension in her own face. I'm fine, Jenny. Just adjusting to the new routine. Are you sure? You sound like you did right after you got back from Afghanistan. I'm not back in Afghanistan, Sarah said more sharply than she'd intended. I'm teaching high school English in Colorado. I know. I'm just saying you sound stressed. Sarah took a deep breath. I'm sorry. It's been a long day. Do you want to talk about it? Sarah considered telling her sister about the confrontation, about the systematic campaign of harassment and intimidation. But Jenny had her own life, her own problems. She didn't need to worry about Sarah's ability to handle a few spoiled teenagers. I'm fine, Sarah said. Just tired. Okay, but call me if you need anything. Promise? I promise. After hanging up, Sarah sat in her living room for a long time, staring at the wall where she'd hung her military commendations. The Bronze Star, the Combat Medical Badge, the certificates of appreciation from units she'd served with. Reminders of a time when her role had been clear, when she'd known exactly what she was fighting for and against. Now the battle lines were blurred. She was fighting for her right to teach, to maintain professional standards, to treat all students fairly. But her opponents were children, legally speaking, and they were using their youth and privilege as weapons against her. Sarah opened her laptop and began typing a detailed report of the day's events. She documented the classroom confrontation, the after-hours intimidation, and the specific threats that had been made. She saved the file to her hard drive and backed it up to cloud storage. If this escalated further, she wanted a complete record of everything that had happened. Before going to bed, Sarah pulled out her old tactical vest and ran her hands over the worn fabric. It had saved her life more than once, protecting her from shrapnel and bullets in a war zone thousands of miles away. Now she was fighting a different kind of war, one that required different armor. She folded the vest carefully and put it back in the closet. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts to break her spirit and drive her away. But Sarah Mitchell had survived worse things than high school bullies. She'd learned to fight battles where the stakes were measured in lives, not test scores. The question was whether she could win this war without becoming the kind of person she'd sworn never to be again. Whether she could protect herself and her students without crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Whether she could prove that sometimes the best response to intimidation was simply refusing to be intimidated. As she turned off the lights and settled into bed, Sarah felt the familiar calm that came before decisive action. She'd given diplomacy a chance. She'd tried to handle the situation through proper channels. But Jake Harrison and his friends had made it clear that they weren't interested in peaceful coexistence. Tomorrow she'd begin preparing for the next phase of the conflict. Not because she wanted to fight, but because she'd learned long ago that some battles couldn't be avoided. They could only be won or lost, and Sarah Mitchell had no intention of losing. The morning brought news that changed everything. Sarah arrived at school to find Principal Hayes waiting for her in the parking lot, his expression grave. "I need to see you in my office," he said without preamble. Sarah followed him through the building, noting the way students stopped their conversations to watch her pass. Word had spread about something, and the atmosphere felt charged with anticipation. Hayes closed his office door and gestured for her to sit. "I received a call from David Harrison this morning. He's filing a formal complaint against you." "What kind of complaint?" "Harassment and intimidation of his son. He claims you've been singling out Jake for criticism and creating a hostile classroom environment." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "That's not accurate." "He has witnesses," Hayes continued. "Other parents who say their children have complained about your teaching methods." "What specific methods?" Hayes pulled out a folder and opened it. "Aggressive questioning, political indoctrination, and inappropriate discussions of military violence." Sarah studied the papers Hayes showed her. The complaints were detailed and specific, painting a picture of a teacher who was unstable, biased, and potentially dangerous. They were also completely fabricated, but proving that would be difficult. "I've documented every interaction with these students," Sarah said. "My lesson plans are available for review. Any parent is welcome to observe my classes." "I'm not questioning your professionalism," Hayes said. "But I have to take these complaints seriously. The school board is meeting an emergency session this afternoon to discuss my employment, to discuss the situation. I've been asked to suspend you pending investigation." Sarah felt the familiar calm descend over her, the same stillness she'd experienced in combat when everything depended on making the right decision under pressure. "I see. I'm sorry, Sarah. I know this isn't fair, but I have to follow procedure." "I understand." Hayes handed her a formal letter outlining the suspension terms. "You're not to contact students or parents directly. You're not to come on school property except for scheduled meetings. The investigation should take about a week." Sarah stood up, gathering her dignity around her like armor. "I'll cooperate fully with the investigation." I hope we can resolve this quickly, Hayes said. You're a good teacher, and I'd hate to lose you. Sarah walked out of the school building for what might be the last time, carrying her personal belongings in a cardboard box. Students watched from classroom windows. As she loaded her car, their faces a mixture of curiosity and judgment. She could see Jake Harrison standing near the main entrance, surrounded by his friends, all of them wearing expressions of barely concealed triumph. As she drove away from Westfield High School, Sarah realized that the real battle was just beginning. They'd succeeded in removing her from the classroom, but they'd also underestimated her resolve. She'd survived Afghanistan, navigated the challenges of transitioning to civilian life, and rebuilt herself from the ground up. A few privileged teenagers weren't going to destroy everything she'd worked for. The war had entered a new phase, and Sarah Mitchell was ready to fight it on her own terms. The suspension hit Sarah like a tactical withdrawal under enemy fire, forcing her to regroup and reassess her position from outside the battlefield. For the first time in weeks, she found herself with unlimited time to think, plan, and investigate the forces arrayed against her. Her small apartment became a command center where she spread out documents, transcripts, and evidence like intelligence reports across her kitchen table. The official letter from the school district was professionally worded, but devastating in its implications. Pending investigation of serious allegations regarding classroom conduct, professional demeanor, and potential safety concerns. The language was carefully chosen to suggest misconduct, without making specific accusations that could later be proven false. Sarah recognized the legal maneuvering, the way bureaucrats protected themselves while throwing subordinates to the wolves. Her phone rang constantly during the first day of suspension. Local news outlets had somehow gotten wind of the story, though the details they possessed were suspiciously one-sided. A veteran teacher accused of intimidating students. Questions about military personnel and civilian roles. Concerns about post-traumatic stress affecting classroom behavior. Each story painted her as potentially dangerous, a ticking time bomb who'd fooled administrators into hiring her. Sarah declined all interview requests and instead focused on building her defense. She contacted the Colorado Education Association and retained an employment attorney who specialized in wrongful termination cases. Margaret Chun, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who'd spent decades fighting for teachers' rights, reviewed Sarah's documentation with professional detachment. "Your record-keeping is exemplary," Margaret said, spreading Sarah's photographs and notes across her conference table. "Most teachers don't think to document harassment until it's too late." "Military training," Sarah replied. "Document everything, trust nothing to memory. These complaints against you are detailed, but they're also suspiciously coordinated. Same language patterns, similar accusations, filed within hours of each other." Margaret pulled out copies of the formal complaints that Hayes had shown Sarah. David Harrison's letter uses phrases like hostile environment and inappropriate. Military mindset. Tyler Brooks's mother uses almost identical language. Marcus Webb's father references the same incidents with remarkably similar details. They coordinated their stories. Almost certainly, but proving that will be difficult. Rich parents. Hire expensive lawyers who know how to make fabricated complaints look legitimate. Sarah studied the documents, noting patterns she'd missed during her initial review. "What are my options? Fight or settle? If you fight, this could drag on for months. Your reputation will suffer, regardless of the outcome. If you settle, you'll probably have to resign quietly in exchange for a neutral reference. And if I win?" Margaret's expression was grim. "You'll be the teacher who fought the school board and won. That's not a resume enhancement in most districts." Sarah gathered the papers and put them back in her briefcase. "I'm not running. I was hoping you'd say that." That evening, Sarah drove through Westfield's residential neighborhoods, studying the community she'd tried to serve. The Harrison family lived in a sprawling colonial on Maple Street, with a circular driveway and a 3-car garage. Security cameras monitored the property, and a sign warned that the grounds were protected by a private security company. David Harrison's car dealership occupied a prime location on Main Street, with banners advertising his family's 3 generations of service to the community. The Webb family owned a large ranch-style home near the country club, with Marcus's wrestling trophies visible through the front window. Tyler Brooks lived in a modern mansion overlooking the golf course, while Derek Stone's family occupied a Victorian house that had been featured in the local historical society's annual tour. These were people who'd never known uncertainty, never questioned their place in the world's hierarchy. They'd built their children in their own image, raising princes who expected deference and submission from everyone around them. Sarah represented a threat to that natural order, a reminder that competence could matter more than connections. Her investigation into the Harrison family revealed a pattern of using wealth and influence to solve problems. David Harrison had successfully lobbied to change zoning laws that would have affected his business. He'd donated enough money to the hospital to have a wing named after his family. He'd served on the school board for 8 years, during which time several teachers had resigned under mysterious circumstances. Sarah's military contacts provided additional intelligence. A friend from her old unit now worked as a private investigator in Denver, and she was able to trace some interesting connections. The law firm representing the complaining parents had previously defended David Harrison in a lawsuit involving discriminatory hiring practices. The private security company monitoring his house was owned by his brother-in-law. The local newspaper's editor was married to Tyler Brooks's aunt. It was a web of influence that explained how 4 families could coordinate their attack so effectively. They weren't just wealthy parents protecting their children. They were a power structure defending itself against an outsider who refused to accept their rules. The breakthrough came on Wednesday, when Sarah's phone rang at 7 a.m. The caller was Emma Foster, the young art teacher who'd been friendly but distant during Sarah's brief tenure at Westfield. "Can we meet somewhere private?" Emma asked, her voice tense with nervousness. "I have something important to tell you." They met at a coffee shop in the next town over, where Emma wouldn't be recognized by Westfield residents. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and hands that trembled slightly as she stirred her latte. "I should have said something earlier," Emma began, "but I was scared." "About what?" "About what they did to you, what they're still doing." Emma pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a series of text messages. Screenshots of group chats where Jake and his friends bragged about their campaign against her. Detailed discussions of how they'd coordinated their parents' complaints. References to previous teachers they'd successfully driven away. "They call it cleaning house," Emma said. "Getting rid of teachers who don't play along with their system." Sarah studied the messages, noting the casual cruelty and calculated manipulation. "How did you get these?" "I've been dating someone who knows Derek Stone. He showed me the messages because he thought they were funny. He didn't realize I'd care about what happened to you." "Are you willing to testify about this?" Emma's face went pale. "I can't. If they found out I was your source, they'd destroy me too. I've seen what they can do." "What do you mean?" Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. Mrs. Henderson wasn't the first teacher they targeted. 2 years ago, there was a social studies teacher named Robert Chun, Lisa's husband. Sarah leaned forward. "What happened to him?" "He failed Jake on a history project, said it was plagiarized. The next week, someone posted photos online of Robert at a gay bar in Denver. He wasn't out at school, wasn't ready for people to know. Jake's friends spread the photos around social media, made sure everyone in town saw them. That's illegal harassment. Try proving Jake was involved." The photos were posted from anonymous accounts. Robert couldn't handle the attention, the whispers, the way parents looked at him. He resigned at the end of the semester. Sarah felt a cold anger building in her chest. "And the administration did nothing?" What could they do? No one could prove who posted the photos. And Robert was too ashamed to fight back. Is he still teaching? He works at a private school in California now, uses his maiden name. Lisa says he's still afraid to be open about who he is. Sarah thought about Robert Chun, a man whose career and personal life had been destroyed by teenagers with too much power and not enough conscience. Why are you telling me this? Because you're different, Emma said. You're not running. And maybe, if someone finally stands up to them, other people will find the courage to speak up too. What about the other teachers? Don't they see what's happening? They see it, but they're terrified. Mike Rodriguez has 3 kids and a mortgage. Lisa's supporting her parents since Robert lost his job. Everyone knows that crossing the Harrison family means losing your position in this town. Emma slid a flash drive across the table. I copied the text messages and some other things. Chat logs, social media posts, screenshots of them planning their attacks. I can't testify, but maybe you can use this somehow. Sarah pocketed the drive. Thank you. Be careful, Emma warned. They're not done with you yet. I heard Jake telling his friends that they need to make sure you never teach anywhere again. That afternoon, Sarah met with Margaret Chun to review the new evidence. The attorney's expression grew darker as she examined the screenshots and messages. This is a gold mine, Margaret said. Clear evidence of conspiracy, harassment, and defamation. With this, we can prove the complaints against you were orchestrated. Can we use it in the investigation? There might be chain of custody issues since the evidence was obtained by a third party. But it gives us a roadmap for our own investigation. Margaret pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. We need to subpoena phone records, social media accounts, and email communications. If we can establish a pattern of coordination between the families, we can prove the complaints are fraudulent. How long will that take? Months, if they fight us. These families will hire expensive lawyers to block discovery. They'll claim privacy rights, attorney-client privilege, anything to keep their communications secret. Sarah stared out the window at the mountains rising beyond Denver's skyline. What if there was another way? What kind of way? What if they incriminated themselves? Margaret raised an eyebrow. I can't advise you to do anything illegal. Nothing illegal. Just giving them an opportunity to reveal their true nature. That evening, Sarah began planning what she privately called Operation Transparency. If Jake and his friends were proud of their harassment campaign, she'd give them a chance to boast about it publicly. If their parents believed they were protecting their children from an unstable teacher, she'd let them demonstrate their own stability under pressure. She started by creating a detailed timeline of events, from her first day at Westfield through her suspension. Every incident, every escalation, every threat and intimidation. She cross-referenced this with the text messages Emma had provided, showing how each public confrontation had been planned and coordinated in private. Next, she researched the legal and ethical standards governing student conduct in Colorado schools. Harassment, intimidation, and conspiracy to defame were serious offenses, even when committed by minors. The school district had clear policies requiring investigation and discipline for such behavior. Policies that had apparently been ignored when the perpetrators were star athletes from influential families. Sarah's military training had taught her that the best defense was often a strategic offense. Instead of waiting for the school board to conclude their biased investigation, she'd force the real story into the open. But this required careful planning and perfect execution. One mistake could destroy her credibility and confirm her enemy's narrative about her instability. Friday brought an unexpected development. Principal Hayes called to schedule a meeting for the following Monday, when the school board would hear testimony from all parties involved in the complaint. Sarah would have 30 minutes to present her side of the story before the board voted on her continued employment. 30 minutes? Margaret said when Sarah told her about the meeting. That's not nearly enough time to present a proper defense. It's enough time for what I have in mind. What do you mean? Sarah smiled grimly. I mean I'm going to give them exactly what they're asking for. Over the weekend, Sarah prepared her presentation with military precision. She studied every board member's background, their connections to the community, their voting patterns on previous teacher disputes. She practiced her testimony until she could deliver it with calm authority, regardless of interruptions or hostile questions. Most importantly, she prepared for the possibility that Jake and his friends would attend the meeting. Public school. Board hearings were open to the community, and she suspected the Harrison family would want to witness her humiliation firsthand. Sunday evening, Sarah sat in her apartment reviewing her strategy one final time. The evidence was solid, her legal position was strong, and her message was clear. But she knew that facts and law meant little in a political fight against entrenched power. She needed something more, something that would force the community to see these families for what they really were. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice was familiar. Miss Mitchell, this is Lisa Chun. Hello, Lisa. I wanted you to know that some of us are planning to attend the board meeting tomorrow night to support you. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. That's very kind, but you don't need to risk your positions for me. We're tired of being afraid, Lisa said. Emma told me what she shared with you. About Robert, about the pattern of harassment. If we don't stand up now, it'll just keep happening. Who's we? Mike Rodriguez, Emma Foster, 3 teachers from the elementary school, and about a dozen parents whose kids have been bullied by Jake's group. We're not going to let them destroy another good teacher. After hanging up, Sarah realized that her situation had changed. She was no longer fighting alone against a coordinated attack. Other people were finally ready to speak truth to power, to risk their comfortable positions for the sake of what was right. Monday arrived gray and cold, with storm clouds building over the mountains. Sarah dressed carefully in her best suit, the navy blue one she'd worn to job interviews and official ceremonies. She pinned her military service pin to the lapel, a small American flag that identified her as a veteran without being ostentatious about it. The school board meeting was held in the high school auditorium, and by 6 p.m., the room was packed. Sarah recognized many faces from her brief time at Westfield. Students, parents, teachers, and community members had all come to witness what many expected to be her professional execution. The Harrison family occupied the front row, with David Harrison looking stern and confident in expensive suit. Jake sat beside his father, wearing his leather jacket and the expression of someone attending his enemy's trial. Marcus, Tyler, and Derek were scattered throughout the audience with their families, all of them radiating the quiet satisfaction of predators who'd successfully cornered their prey. But Sarah also noticed unexpected faces. Lisa Chun sat with her fellow teachers, their expressions tense but determined. Parents she didn't recognize nodded at her encouragingly. Even some students looked uncomfortable with the proceedings, as if they were beginning to question the narrative they'd been fed. Board President Janet Morrison called the meeting to order and announced that they would hear testimony regarding the employment status of Sarah Mitchell. The charges were read aloud, each accusation delivered with clinical precision. Harassment, intimidation, creation of a hostile learning environment, inappropriate discussion of military violence, and failure to maintain professional standards. David Harrison spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. He painted a picture of a disturbed veteran who'd brought the trauma of war into a peaceful classroom. He spoke of his son's fear, of other parents' concerns, of the district's responsibility to protect students from unstable employees. "We understand that Miss Mitchell has served our country," Harrison concluded, "and we respect that service. But military experience doesn't qualify someone to teach children. In fact, It may disqualify them when they can't leave that experience behind. Tyler Brooks's mother spoke next, tearfully describing her son's distress at being singled out and humiliated by a teacher who seemed to enjoy intimidating students. Marcus Webb's father followed with similar testimony, painting Sarah as a bully who used her military background to frighten teenagers. Each parent delivered their lines with practiced emotion, creating a narrative of victimization that portrayed their children as innocent targets of an unstable adult. The board members listened with grave expressions, occasionally asking clarifying questions that seemed designed to strengthen the complaints rather than test their validity. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she stood calmly and walked to the podium. The auditorium fell silent. Hundreds of eyes focused on her with a mixture of curiosity, hostility, and anticipation. She looked out at the audience, making eye contact with her supporters and her accusers alike. Members of the board, fellow educators, parents, and students, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. I stand before you tonight as someone who has devoted her life to service. First to my country in the United States Army, and more recently to the young people of this community as an educator. She paused, letting her words sink in. I have been accused of creating a hostile environment, of intimidating students, of bringing inappropriate military attitudes into the classroom. These are serious charges, and they deserve serious consideration. Sarah pulled out a folder containing her evidence. I would like to present some additional information for the board's consideration. Text messages, social media posts, and other communications that shed light on what really happened in my classroom. David Harrison half rose from his seat. Objection. This is not a court of law, and evidence obtained improperly should not be considered. Board President Morrison looked uncertain. Miss Mitchell, where did this evidence come from? From the students themselves, Sarah replied calmly. They were apparently proud enough of their campaign against me to document it extensively. She began reading selected excerpts from the text messages Emma had provided. Jake bragging about making another teacher quit. Marcus describing their strategy for coordinating parental complaints. Tyler joking about their previous success in driving Robert Chun out of his position. The auditorium erupted in whispers and shocked murmurs. Jake's face had gone pale, while his father looked furious at this unexpected development. Other parents began looking at the Harrison family with suspicion and disgust. These communications show a clear pattern of harassment and intimidation, directed at multiple teachers over several years, Sarah continued. They reveal a coordinated effort to fabricate complaints and destroy the careers of educators who refuse to compromise their professional standards. She turned to address Jake directly. You and your friends have spent weeks trying to break me, to force me to quit or lower my expectations. You've threatened my reputation, my career, and my future. You've done this before to other teachers, and you expected to do it again. Jake shrank back in his seat, no longer the confident predator who'd cornered her in the empty classroom. Around the auditorium, people were staring at him and his friends with a mixture of shock and revulsion. But here's what you didn't understand, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. I've faced real enemies in real combat. I've been shot at by people who wanted to kill me, not just embarrass me. I've treated wounded soldiers while under fire, made life and death decisions in situations you can't imagine. The room was completely silent now, hanging on every word. So when 4 spoiled teenagers try to intimidate me with daddy's money and empty threats, I don't break. I don't run. I don't compromise my principles or lower my standards to make bullies comfortable. Sarah stepped away from the podium and walked toward where Jake was sitting. He pressed back in his seat as she approached. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. You wanted to know what kind of person I really am? She said, her voice carrying to every corner of the auditorium. I'm the kind of person who stands up to bullies, regardless of their age or their parents' bank accounts. I'm the kind of Person who protects others when they can't protect themselves. And I'm the kind of person who will never, ever back down from doing what's right. The auditorium exploded into chaos. Parents were shouting, students were arguing, and board members were calling for order. Through it all, Sarah stood calmly beside Jake's row, watching as the mask of innocence finally slipped from his face and revealed the cruel, entitled bully underneath. But the real confrontation was still to come. The chaos in the auditorium reached a crescendo as parents demanded answers. Students whispered frantically to each other, and board members struggled to maintain order. David Harrison was on his feet, his face flushed with rage as he pointed an accusing finger at Sarah. "This is a setup," he shouted over the noise. "She's manipulating evidence, coaching witnesses, trying to destroy innocent children because she can't handle the pressure of civilian life." But his words were drowned out by the voices of other parents who had begun connecting dots they'd previously ignored. Mrs. Patterson from the main office stood up in the back of the room, her usually gentle demeanor replaced by steely determination. "I've worked at this school for 15 years, she called out, her voice cutting through the commotion. "I've seen 3 excellent teachers resign under mysterious circumstances. I've watched Jake Harrison and his friends swagger through these halls like they own the place. And I've kept quiet because I needed this job. But not anymore." She pulled out a folder from her purse. "I have documentation of every complaint filed against teachers over the past 5 years. 90% of them came from the same 4 families. 90% of the teachers they targeted were eventually forced to resign. That's not coincidence. That's systematic harassment." Mike Rodriguez stood up next, his broad frame and commanding presence immediately drawing attention. "I coach 3 sports at this school," he announced. "I've watched these boys manipulate teammates, intimidate opponents, and abuse their positions of privilege. I've reported their behavior to administration multiple times, and I've been told repeatedly that boys will be boys and that I should focus on winning games instead of character development." The revelations kept coming like an avalanche gaining momentum. Emma Foster found her voice and stood to speak about the culture of fear that pervaded the faculty. Other teachers began sharing stories of classroom disruptions, grade disputes, and parental intimidation that followed patterns identical to what Sarah had experienced. Even students began to speak up. A nervous sophomore named Jenny Martinez raised her hand and was recognized by the board president. "Jake and his friends have been bullying people since middle school," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "They target anyone who doesn't fit in or who stands up to them. Last year, they made fun of my little brother's stutter so badly that he stopped speaking in class for 2 months. When my mom complained, suddenly my dad's landscaping business lost 3 major contracts." The Harrison family's fortress of respectability was crumbling in real time. Other students found courage in Jenny's example and began sharing their own stories. Academic intimidation, social ostracism, and economic retaliation emerged as common themes in Jake's reign of terror. But Jake himself had remained silent throughout the testimonies, slumped in his seat as if trying to make himself invisible. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by the sullen defiance of someone whose secret had been exposed to the world. Then Marcus Webb made a fatal mistake. Unable to watch his friend's humiliation any longer, he jumped to his feet and shouted across the auditorium, "You're all a bunch of liars. Jake never hurt anybody. You're just jealous because we're successful, and you're not." The moment the words left his mouth, Marcus realized his error. He'd admitted to being part of a "we" that had targeted people, confirming the conspiracy that the text messages had revealed. His father grabbed his arm and tried to pull him back into his seat, but the damage was done. Sarah seized the moment with tactical precision. "Marcus, you just said we're successful. Successful at what, exactly? What have you and Jake been successful at doing to teachers and students who crossed you?" Marcus's face went white as he realized he'd walked into a trap. "I didn't mean." We're just successful students and athletes. We haven't done anything wrong. Then why are there detailed text messages of you planning campaigns against teachers? Why did you and your friends coordinate your parents' complaints against me? Why did you brag about making Robert Chun resign? The auditorium fell silent as everyone waited for Marcus's response. He looked desperately at his father, then at Jake, then back at Sarah. Finally, his teenage composure cracked completely. "Because you people don't belong here," he screamed. "This is our school, our town, our place. We built this community, our families made it what it is, and we're not going to let outsiders come in and change everything." The mask had finally slipped completely. The careful facade of victimhood that the families had constructed dissolved in the face of Marcus's raw honesty about their true motivations. This wasn't about protecting children from an unstable teacher. This was about maintaining a power structure that privileged certain families and excluded everyone else. David Harrison realized that the situation had spiraled beyond recovery. He stood up and began gathering his family to leave, but Sarah's voice stopped him. "Actually, Mr. Harrison, I think there's something else the community should know about your son's behavior." She pulled out her phone and began playing an audio recording. Jake's voice filled the auditorium, crystal clear and unmistakably his own. "Look, lady, we're trying to be nice here. But you need to understand that we have influence in this town. Our parents pay your salary." The recording continued with Tyler's threats about rumors and PTSD, Marcus's intimidation tactics, and Derek's warnings about consequences. Every word of their after-hours confrontation in Sarah's classroom had been captured in perfect detail. "How did you?" Jake started, then stopped as the implications hit him. "Military training includes situational awareness and personal security," Sarah explained calmly. "When 4 students corner a teacher in an empty classroom and begin making threats, recording the conversation is basic self-protection." The audio continued with their escalating threats and demands that she quit quietly. When it reached Jake's final ultimatum about having 2 choices, the auditorium was completely silent except for the playback of teenage voices revealing their true nature. Principal Hayes had gone pale as he listened to his students threatening a teacher on school property. Board members exchanged shocked glances as they heard clear evidence of harassment and intimidation. Parents who had supported the Harrison family began edging away from them as if guilt were contagious. But the most devastating moment came when Jake's voice on the recording said, "This is our territory. We decide who belongs and who doesn't." The community was hearing, in Jake's own words, the entitled arrogance that had driven years of harassment and abuse. There was no way to deny it, no way to spin it as innocent teenage behavior or misunderstood intentions. Tyler Brooks couldn't handle the pressure any longer. He stood up abruptly and pointed at Sarah with shaking finger. "You set us up," he shouted. "You recorded us without permission. That's illegal." "Actually," Margaret Chun said, standing from her seat near the back of the auditorium, "Colorado is a one-party consent state. Miss Mitchell had every right to record a conversation she was part of, especially when she felt threatened." The attorney's presence sent ripples of unease through the Harrison contingent. They'd expected to face a lone teacher with limited resources, not a coordinated legal challenge backed by documented evidence. But the evening's revelations weren't finished. Emma Foster approached the microphone with visible nervousness, but steely determination. "There's something else everyone should know," she said. The harassment campaign against Miss Mitchell included plans for a final confrontation that would force her to physically submit to their authority. She pulled out her phone and began reading from the text messages she'd saved. Jake wrote, "We need to get her alone and make her understand who's really in charge. Make her crawl if we have to." Marcus replied, "The gym after school is perfect. No cameras, no witnesses." Tyler added, "Once she's on her knees begging, we'll know she's broken." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. The community was hearing their local heroes discussing plans to humiliate and degrade a teacher through physical intimidation. The gap between their public image and private reality had become an unbridgeable chasm. Derek Stone's mother gasped audibly and turned to stare at her son with horror. "Derek, please tell me you weren't part of this." Derek had been the quietest of the group throughout the evening, but now he broke completely under his mother's gaze. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," he whispered. "We just wanted her to quit like the others. We didn't think." "Didn't think what?" his mother demanded. "Didn't think forcing a woman to crawl was serious? Didn't think threatening someone's career and reputation was wrong?" The confrontation between Derek and his mother became a microcosm of the larger community reckoning taking place. Families were forced to confront the reality of what their children had become under the influence of wealth and privilege, unchecked by accountability. But Jake Harrison wasn't finished. The exposure of their plans seemed to trigger something desperate in him, a final attempt to salvage his reputation and power. He stood up and walked toward the front of the auditorium, his leather jacket hanging loose on his frame, but his jaw set with familiar arrogance. "You want to know the truth?" he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "Yes, we planned to confront her. Yes, we wanted her gone. And yes, we would have made her crawl if that's what it took." The auditorium erupted in gasps and shouts, but Jake continued, his voice rising above the noise. "Because this is our school, our town, our future. We've earned our positions through years of hard work and achievement. We've brought glory to this community through our athletic success and academic excellence. And we're not going to let some washed-up soldier come in here and tear down everything we've built." It was a stunning display of entitlement and arrogance that revealed the true depth of Jake's corruption. He wasn't just admitting to harassment and intimidation. He was justifying it, claiming it was his right to terrorize anyone who challenged his authority. David Harrison tried to grab his son and pull him away from the microphone, but Jake shrugged off his father's grip and kept talking. "She thinks her military service makes her special. She thinks surviving Afghanistan makes her tough. We've been fighting our own war right here, protecting our way of life from people who want to change everything we've worked for." The comparison between his privilege-protected bullying and actual military service was so tone-deaf and offensive that even some of his previous supporters began turning against him. Veterans in the audience bristled at hearing their sacrifice compared to teenage harassment campaigns. But Jake's tirade provided Sarah with the perfect opportunity for her final move. She walked slowly toward the front of the auditorium, her movements deliberate and controlled. The room fell silent as she approached Jake, who suddenly seemed much smaller and younger than his 17 years. "You're right about one thing," Sarah said, her voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. "I did serve in Afghanistan. I did see combat. I did lose friends and colleagues to people who believed their ideology gave them the right to terrorize others." She stopped directly in front of Jake, close enough that he had to look up slightly to meet her eyes. "But here's what you don't understand about real warriors, real strength, real courage. It's not about dominating others or forcing them to submit. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous." Jake tried to maintain eye contact but found himself looking away, unable to match her steady gaze. "You wanted me to crawl," Sarah continued. "You planned to corner me in an empty gymnasium and force me to my knees. You thought that would prove your power, your superiority, your right to rule over others." She paused, letting the weight of his planned humiliation sink in throughout the auditorium. But real strength doesn't come from making others submit. It comes from lifting them up. Real leadership doesn't come from intimidation. It comes from inspiration. And real courage doesn't come from attacking the vulnerable. It comes from defending them. The silence in the auditorium was complete, broken only by the sound of people breathing and the occasional shuffle of feet. Jake stood frozen in front of Sarah, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "So here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, her voice taking on the tone of command she'd used with her medical unit in combat zones. "You're going to apologize to every teacher you've harassed, every student you've bullied, every family you've intimidated. You're going to face the consequences of your actions like the adult you claim to be. I don't have to do anything you say," Jake whispered, but his voice lacked any conviction. "You're right," Sarah replied. "You don't have to do anything I say. But the community has heard your own words, your own plans, your own justifications for harassment and intimidation. They've seen who you really are when you think no one is watching." She gestured toward the packed auditorium. "These people trusted you with their children's safety, their community's reputation, their school's integrity. And you've betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible." Jake's facade finally cracked completely. The confident predator who'd terrorized teachers and students dissolved into a 17-year-old boy who'd been exposed as a fraud in front of everyone who mattered to him. Tears began streaming down his face as the weight of his actions and their consequences finally hit him. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." But Sarah wasn't finished. "Sorry isn't enough," she said. "Sorry doesn't undo the damage you've caused to Robert Chun's career and personal life. Sorry doesn't heal the trauma you've inflicted on younger students. Sorry doesn't restore the trust you've shattered in this community." She turned to address the entire auditorium. "This isn't just about one teacher or one group of students. This is about what kind of community we want to be. Do we want to be a place where wealth and privilege excuse harassment and cruelty? Do we want to raise children who believe their success gives them the right to destroy others?" The crowd was hanging on every word, recognizing that this moment would define their community's character for years to come. Or do we want to be a place where everyone is held to the same standards of decency and respect? Where teachers can educate without fear of retaliation? Where students can learn without being bullied or intimidated? Board President Morrison finally found her voice. "Miss Mitchell, I think I speak for the entire board when I say that the charges against you are completely without merit. We formally apologize for the investigation and offer you immediate reinstatement with full back pay." But Sarah shook her head. "Thank you, but I won't be returning to Westfield High School." The announcement sent a ripple of surprise through the auditorium. After everything she'd endured, after proving her innocence so decisively, why would she walk away? "I came here to teach," Sarah explained. "But I've learned that real education sometimes happens outside the classroom. Tonight, this community has learned valuable lessons about power, privilege, accountability, and justice. That's more important than any English curriculum I could have delivered." She looked directly at Jake, who was still standing near the microphone with tears on his face. "But my work here isn't finished. Jake, Marcus, Tyler, and Derek have learned that actions have consequences. Now they need to learn how to make amends, how to rebuild trust, how to become the kind of men this community deserves." Sarah pulled out a business card and handed it to Principal Hayes. "I'll be starting a nonprofit organization focused on anti-bullying education and teacher protection advocacy. I'd like to work with Westfield High School to develop new policies and training programs that prevent this kind of abuse from happening again." The auditorium erupted in applause, but Sarah raised her hand for silence. "This isn't about victory or vindication," she said. "This is about healing. About making sure that future teachers and students don't have to endure what Robert Chen endured, what I endured, what countless others have suffered in silence." She turned back to Jake one final time. "You have a choice now. You can learn from this experience and become someone who protects others instead of preying on them. Or you can let bitterness and resentment turn you into everything that's wrong with the world." Jake nodded through his tears, finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd done and what he'd lost. "The choice is yours," Sarah said. "But remember that everyone in this room will be watching to see which path you choose." As the meeting finally wound down and people began filing out of the auditorium, Sarah found herself surrounded by supporters offering thanks and encouragement. Teachers who'd been afraid to speak up, parents whose children had been bullied, students who'd witnessed harassment but felt powerless to stop it. Lisa Chun approached with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "For Robert, for all of us, for showing us that we don't have to accept this behavior." Emma Foster joined them, no longer nervous but glowing with newfound confidence. "I've already talked to 5 other teachers about starting a faculty union. We're not going to be isolated and vulnerable anymore." Mike Rodriguez clapped Sarah on the shoulder with his massive hand. "You've got my full support for whatever comes next. These kids need to learn that athletic ability doesn't excuse moral failure." As the crowd thinned, Sarah noticed that the Harrison family had gathered near the side exit. David Harrison looked older than he had at the beginning of the evening, the weight of his son's exposure and his own complicity etched in the lines around his eyes. Jake approached her hesitantly, his letter jacket now seeming like a costume rather than a badge of honor. "Miss Mitchell," he said quietly, "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want you to know that I understand what I did was wrong. All of it." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of genuine remorse rather than calculated manipulation. What she saw was a broken 17-year-old who'd finally confronted the consequences of his actions. "Understanding is the first step," she said, "but it's going to take years of consistent behavior to prove that understanding has become real change." "I want to try," Jake said. "I want to be better than what I've been." "Then start by helping the people you've hurt," Sarah replied. "Use your influence to protect others instead of exploiting them. Become the leader this community actually needs instead of the tyrant you've been." Jake nodded and walked away, leaving Sarah alone in the now empty auditorium. She stood there for a moment, processing everything that had happened. When she'd first arrived at Westfield High School, she'd wanted nothing more than to teach English literature to teenagers. She'd never expected to become the catalyst for a community-wide reckoning with privilege, power, and accountability. But as she gathered her things and prepared to leave, Sarah realized that this had been exactly the mission she was meant to fulfill. Not as a teacher in a traditional classroom, but as an educator in the broader sense. Someone who helped people learn hard truths about themselves and their community. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret Chun. "3 other school districts have already called about hiring you. Word travels fast." Sarah smiled as she typed her reply. "Not interested in traditional teaching positions. Have other plans." As she walked out of Westfield High School for the final time, Sarah felt the same sense of mission completion she'd experienced at the end of successful military operations. The objective had been achieved, the enemy had been defeated, and the community was safer because of her efforts. But unlike her military service, this victory had been won not through violence, but through truth. Not through destruction, but through revelation. Not through force, but through the simple act of refusing to be intimidated by people who'd never faced real opposition. The next morning brought news that surprised no one who'd witnessed the previous evening's events. Jake Harrison had resigned from the football team and withdrawn his college applications. Marcus Webb had been suspended from the wrestling team pending investigation. Tyler Brooks and Derek Stone had been removed from their leadership positions in student government. More importantly, the school board had voted unanimously to implement new anti-harassment policies with real teeth. Teachers would receive training on documenting and reporting abuse. Students would face meaningful consequences for intimidation and bullying. And wealthy parents would no longer be able to shield their children from accountability through donations and influence. The changes weren't just limited to the school. David Harrison announced that he was stepping down from the school board and several community organizations. Other parents began questioning their own children's behavior and their role in enabling it. Within a month, Sarah had established the Westfield Foundation for Educational Integrity, with funding from donors who wanted to support teachers facing harassment and retaliation. Her first hire was Robert Chun, who returned to Colorado to help develop training programs for educators dealing with bullying and intimidation. Emma Foster was promoted to department head after organizing the teachers' union. Lisa Chun became the new chair of the school board's ethics committee. Mike Rodriguez implemented character education requirements for all athletic programs. But perhaps the most meaningful change came from an unexpected source. Jake Harrison, after completing a voluntary suspension and community service program, requested a meeting with Sarah. They met at the same coffee shop where Emma had first shared the text messages that broke the case open. Jake looked different, no longer carrying himself with the arrogant confidence that had defined his high school career. "I wanted to thank you," he said, surprising Sarah with his opening words. "Thank me?" "For not giving up on me," Jake explained. "For believing that I could change instead of just writing me off as hopeless." Sarah studied his face, noting the genuine humility that had replaced his former entitlement. "What have you learned?" "That being strong doesn't mean making others weak. That being a leader means serving others, not ruling them. That respect has to be earned through character, not demanded through intimidation. Those are good lessons," Sarah said. "What are you going to do with them?" Jake pulled out a college application. "I'm applying to Colorado State as a regular student, not an athlete. I want to study education and counseling. I want to help kids who are being bullied instead of being the one who bullies them. That's a significant career change." "I have a lot of damage to undo," Jake said. "I figure I should spend my life trying to prevent other kids from making my mistakes." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced when treating wounded soldiers who recovered fully and returned to meaningful lives. Sometimes the most broken people became the strongest advocates for healing. "What about your friends?" "Marcus and Tyler are still angry, still blaming everyone but themselves. Derek is getting counseling and seems to be making progress, but we're not friends anymore. I can't be around people who bring out the worst in me." Jake paused, then continued with obvious difficulty. "I know I can't undo what I did to you, to Mr. Chun, to all the other people I hurt. But I want you to know that every day I wake up thinking about how to be better than I was yesterday." "That's all any of us can do," Sarah replied. "The person you were at 17 doesn't have to be the person you are for the rest of your life." As they parted ways, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn her life had taken. She'd come to Westfield hoping to teach literature and ended up teaching lessons about courage, integrity, and the power of standing up to injustice. Her story became a model for other educators facing similar challenges. Teachers across the country reached out for advice on documenting harassment, building support networks, and fighting back against systematic intimidation. The Westfield Foundation grew into a national organization providing legal support, counseling services, and advocacy training for educators under attack. Sarah found herself testifying before state legislatures about teacher protection laws and consulting with school districts about anti-bullying policies. But perhaps most importantly, she'd proven that one person with the courage to stand up could inspire an entire community to examine its values and make meaningful changes. Years later, when people asked Sarah about her time at Westfield High School, she would tell them it was the most important teaching she'd ever done. Not because of the English curriculum she'd planned to deliver, but because of the life lessons that emerged from refusing to be intimidated by bullies, regardless of their age or their parents' influence. She'd learned that real strength comes not from overpowering others, but from empowering them. That true courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting correctly despite that fear. And that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields, but in small communities where ordinary people find extraordinary ways to stand up for what's right. The girl who'd wanted to disappear had become impossible to ignore. The teacher who'd been targeted for destruction had become a force for positive change. And the community that had tried to break her spirit had ended up healing its own wounds through her example. In the end, Sarah Mitchell had done exactly what she'd set out to do from the beginning. She'd educated young people about the most important subjects of all: character, integrity, and the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult. She'd just done it in a way none of them had expected. 5 years after the night that changed everything at Westfield High School, Sarah Mitchell stood before a packed auditorium at the Colorado State Capitol, addressing a joint session of the legislature about the Teacher Protection Act she'd helped draft. The woman at the podium bore little resemblance to the quiet English teacher who'd once hoped to blend into the background of a small-town school. Her dark hair now carried threads of silver at the temples, and her eyes held the confidence of someone who'd fought battles on multiple fronts and emerged victorious. The navy blazer was custom-tailored, a necessity for someone who testified before congressional committees and consulted with education departments across the nation. But pinned to her lapel was the same small American flag she'd worn to her first faculty meeting at Westfield, a reminder of where her journey had begun. "Honorable senators and representatives," Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority of hard-won experience. "5 years ago, I was a first-year teacher who believed that dedication and professionalism would be enough to protect me from harassment and intimidation. I learned, as too many educators learn every year, that being right isn't always enough when you're facing systematic abuse from those in power." The legislative chamber was unusually quiet for a policy hearing. Sarah's story had become legendary in education circles, a cautionary tale about unchecked privilege and an inspiration for those fighting institutional corruption. But what few people knew was how the aftermath had unfolded, how her victory at that school board meeting had been just the beginning of a much larger transformation. The Westfield Foundation for Educational Integrity had grown from a one-person operation, run out of Sarah's apartment, to a multi-million-dollar organization with offices in 12 states. They'd successfully defended over 300 teachers, facing harassment and retaliation, exposed corruption in dozens of school districts, and lobbied for legislation protecting educators' rights in 38 states. But Sarah's greatest pride came from the unexpected partnerships that had emerged from the wreckage of that October evening. Jake Harrison, now 22 and a senior at Colorado State studying education and psychology, served as the foundation's youth outreach coordinator. His transformation from entitled bully to passionate advocate had become almost as famous as Sarah's original confrontation with the school board. The path to redemption hadn't been easy for Jake. After his public breakdown at the school board meeting, he'd spent 6 months in intensive counseling, working through years of entitlement and learned cruelty. His parents had divorced during his senior year, with his mother citing her inability to reconcile with the man who'd raised their son to believe wealth excused cruelty. David Harrison had lost his position on the school board and faced federal investigation for his business practices after whistleblowers came forward with evidence of discriminatory hiring and contracting. The family's social standing in Westfield had crumbled completely, forcing Jake to confront a reality where his name carried shame rather than privilege. But instead of retreating into bitterness or denial, Jake had chosen the harder path of genuine change. He'd spent his gap year working with anti-bullying organizations, sharing his story at schools across Colorado, and helping other privileged students understand the damage their behavior could cause. When he applied to college, Jake had written his admission essay about the night Sarah Mitchell taught him the difference between power and strength. He'd described the moment when his carefully constructed image had collapsed, and forced him to confront the person he'd become. The essay had gone viral when the admissions officer shared it anonymously, becoming a case study in accountability and growth. Now Jake worked directly with Sarah, using his experience as a former bully to connect with students who reminded him of his younger self. Together, they developed intervention programs that identified potential harassment before it escalated to the level of abuse Sarah had faced. Marcus Webb had chosen a different path. Still angry and unrepentant, he'd transferred to a private school in Denver for his senior year, where his family's money could still buy protection from consequences. He'd gone on to college on a wrestling scholarship, but had been dismissed from the team after multiple incidents involving hazing and sexual misconduct. Last Sarah had heard, he was working at his uncle's construction company and facing civil lawsuits from several of his former teammates. Tyler Brooks had attempted suicide during his senior year, overwhelmed by the social ostracism that followed his exposure as a systematic bully. His recovery had been slow and painful, involving years of therapy and gradual rebuilding of his sense of self-worth. He now worked as a counselor at a residential treatment facility for troubled adolescents, using his own experience with cruelty and redemption to help others find their way back from destructive behavior. Derek Stone had perhaps made the most complete transformation of the group. After confessing his role in the harassment campaign to his mother that night at the school board meeting, he'd spent his remaining high school years working to make amends to everyone he'd hurt. He'd graduated valedictorian, using his speech to deliver a powerful message about privilege, accountability, and the courage required to change. Derek had gone on to study law at the University of Colorado, specializing in civil rights and education policy. He now worked as a staff attorney for the Westfield Foundation, helping draft the very legislation Sarah was presenting to the Colorado legislature. The Teacher Protection Act represented 5 years of painstaking research, coalition building, and political negotiation. It would require school districts to investigate harassment complaints within 30 days, provide legal defense funds for teachers facing retaliation, and impose financial penalties on districts that failed to protect their employees from systematic abuse. The act we're proposing today isn't just about protecting teachers, Sarah continued, addressing the assembled legislators. It's about protecting the integrity of public education itself. When educators can be silenced through intimidation, when wealth and influence can override professional standards, when children learn that power matters more than truth, we fail not just individual teachers but entire communities. Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Education Committee, leaned forward at her microphone. Ms. Mitchell, critics of this legislation argue that it could make it harder for parents to address legitimate concerns about teacher performance. How do you respond to that? Sarah had anticipated this question, having faced it dozens of times during committee hearings and public forums. Senator Williams, there's a clear distinction between legitimate feedback and systematic harassment. A parent who questions a grade or requests a conference is exercising appropriate oversight. A group of parents who coordinate false accusations, make threats to a teacher's career, and use their influence to bypass due process is engaging in abuse. She clicked to the next slide in her presentation, showing statistics from the Foundation's case files. Our research indicates that 93% of harassment campaigns involve coordination between multiple families with significant community influence. 87% target teachers who've refused to compromise academic standards. For privileged students, these aren't isolated incidents or misunderstandings. They're organized efforts to maintain systems of unequal treatment. Representative Michael Torres raised his hand. What about the financial impact on school districts? Won't this legislation create additional bureaucracy and expense? Representative Torres, the current system is far more expensive than what we're proposing, Sarah replied. Westfield High School spent over $400,000 in legal fees and administrative costs during the 5 years before my case. defending against harassment complaints and teacher turnover. After implementing the policies we're recommending, their costs dropped by 70% while teacher retention improved dramatically. The hearing continued for another hour, with Sarah fielding questions about implementation timelines, enforcement mechanisms, and coordination with federal civil rights law. She'd become expert in the technical aspects of education policy, learning to speak the language of bureaucrats and politicians while never losing sight of the human cost of institutional failure. When the formal hearing concluded, Sarah was approached by Representative Maria Santos, a former teacher who'd been one of the bill's earliest supporters. "That was masterful," Santos said, shaking Sarah's hand. "You've come a long way from that school board meeting video that went viral." Sarah smiled, remembering the amateur recording that had captured her confrontation with Jake and his friends. The footage had been shared millions of times across social media, turning her into an unlikely symbol of resistance against institutional bullying. "Sometimes the most important lessons happen outside the classroom. Speaking of which, I heard Jake Harrison is working with your foundation now. That must have been a difficult decision." "Actually, it was one of the easiest decisions I've ever made," Sarah replied. "Jake understands the mindset of privileged bullies better than anyone else on our team. He knows how they think, what motivates them, and most importantly, what it takes to change." Santos looked skeptical. "You really believe people can change that fundamentally? I've seen it happen. Not just with Jake, but with dozens of students we've worked with over the years. The key is accountability paired with genuine opportunity for redemption. Most bullies have never faced real consequences for their behavior. When they do, some double down and become worse. But others wake up and realize they want to be better people." As Sarah left the Capitol building, she reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken since that October evening in Westfield. She'd never imagined becoming a nationally recognized advocate for teacher rights, testifying before Congress, or running a foundation that employed over 50 people across multiple states. But perhaps the most surprising development had been her relationship with Jake Harrison. What had started as professional collaboration had evolved into something resembling friendship, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to preventing others from experiencing what they'd been through. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Jake. "Watching the live stream from the office. You crushed it." The Torah's question about financial impact was perfect setup for the Westfield cost analysis. She typed back, "Team effort. Your research on implementation costs made the difference." The partnership between former adversaries had raised eyebrows throughout the education advocacy community. Some critics argued that Sarah was naive to trust someone who'd orchestrated such a vicious harassment campaign. Others suggested she was seeking attention by maintaining ties to the most notorious case in her foundation's history. But Sarah had learned to ignore critics who'd never faced the choice between grudges and growth. Jake's transformation had been gradual and authentic, marked by thousands of small decisions to choose accountability over defensiveness, service over privilege, humility over arrogance. The real test had come 2 years earlier when the foundation was approached by a group of teachers facing harassment from wealthy parents in a Connecticut suburb. The case was nearly identical to Sarah's experience at Westfield, involving coordinated complaints, false accusations, and systematic intimidation of educators who refused to lower standards for privileged students. Jake had volunteered to testify about his own behavior, sharing details of how he and his friends had organized their campaign against Sarah. His testimony had been devastating to the harassing parents' credibility, providing a roadmap for how such conspiracies operated and why they needed to be taken seriously by school administrators. The Connecticut case had resulted in a 6-figure settlement for the targeted teachers and criminal charges against 2 parents for conspiracy and intimidation. More importantly, it had established legal precedent that coordinated harassment campaigns could be prosecuted under federal civil rights law. Sarah's work had expanded beyond individual cases to systemic reform. She'd consulted with the Department of Education on developing national guidelines for investigating teacher harassment. She'd worked with teacher preparation programs to help new educators recognize and document abuse before it escalated. She'd even testified before international education conferences about the global problem of institutional bullying. But the most meaningful moments still came from individual teachers who reached out for help. Just last week, she'd received a call from a young science teacher in Oregon whose students were recording her lessons and editing them to make her appear incompetent. The harassment campaign bore all the hallmarks of the Westfield model. Coordinated. Parent complaints, social media attacks, and administrative pressure to resign quietly. Within 24 hours, the foundation had connected the teacher with legal representation, documented the harassment pattern, and provided media training for what would likely become a public battle. The teacher wouldn't face the isolation and confusion that had characterized Sarah's early experience at Westfield. As Sarah drove home through the Denver suburbs, she thought about the evening ahead. She was having dinner with Emma Foster, who'd become a close friend over the years. Emma had left teaching after earning her master's degree in educational administration and now served as the foundation's director of teacher support services. Their friendship had been forged in the aftermath of that school board meeting, when both women had realized they were stronger together than apart. Emma's willingness to risk her career by sharing evidence of Jake's harassment campaign had been the turning point in Sarah's case, and their professional relationship had evolved into genuine affection and mutual respect. Emma was waiting at their usual restaurant, a small Italian place that had become their monthly tradition. She looked up from her menu as Sarah approached, noting the slight tension in her friend's shoulders. "Long day at the Capitol?" Emma asked. "Productive day," Sarah corrected, sliding into the booth across from her. "The bill should pass committee next week, and we have enough votes for floor passage." "That's fantastic." "Jake must be thrilled. This legislation has been his pet project for months." Sarah nodded, remembering Jake's passionate arguments for stronger enforcement mechanisms and clearer reporting requirements. His insight into how harassment campaigns operated had shaped key provisions of the bill, particularly the sections addressing coordinated parent complaints and social media attacks. "He's grown into this role in ways I never expected," Sarah said. "Sometimes I forget he's still only 22. His maturity and commitment are remarkable." Emma studied her friend's face. "You sound like a proud mentor." "Maybe I am." "Is that strange, considering how we met?" "It would be strange if you weren't proud," Emma replied. "Jake's transformation is one of your greatest achievements. Not just stopping his harassment campaign, but helping him become someone who prevents others from following his path." Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone ringing. The caller ID showed Jake's name, which was unusual since he typically texted rather than called during evening hours. "Sarah, I'm sorry to bother you, but we have a situation," Jake said, his voice tense with concern. "I just got a call from a teacher in Texas. The harassment she's facing is escalating rapidly, and I think we might be looking at physical threats." Sarah's demeanor shifted immediately, the relaxed dinner companion replaced by the focused advocate who'd fought dozens of similar battles. "What's the timeline?" "She was told today that if she doesn't resign by Friday, they'll make sure she never works in education again." Anonymous letters started appearing at her house this weekend. Someone spray-painted "Quit" on her car last night. Physical location: Austin suburb. Wealthy district, similar demographics to Westfield. The targeted teacher is African American, which adds a racial dimension we haven't seen in most of our cases. Sarah was already calculating logistics and resources. "Send me everything you have. I'll drive to Austin tomorrow and meet with her in person. Can you coordinate with Derek on the legal research? This sounds like it might involve federal civil rights violations." "Already on it." Derek's pulling precedent cases involving racial harassment of teachers. Margaret Chun's firm is standing by if we need immediate legal intervention. Emma watched the conversation with admiration for the machine-like efficiency Sarah and Jake had developed over years of collaboration. What had started as mutual wariness had evolved into seamless professional partnership, with each understanding their role in the Foundation's mission. After hanging up, Sarah turned to Emma with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry, but I need to cut dinner short. This Texas case sounds serious." "Don't apologize. This is why the Foundation exists." As they walked to their cars, Emma reflected on how much their lives had changed since that night at Westfield High School. Sarah had become a national figure in education advocacy, while Emma had found her calling in supporting teachers facing harassment and intimidation. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation had been Jake Harrison's evolution from entitled bully to passionate advocate. Emma had been skeptical when Sarah first suggested bringing him into the Foundation, remembering the arrogant teenager who'd terrorize teachers and students with impunity. Yet watching Jake work with vulnerable teachers, seeing his genuine remorse and commitment to preventing others from experiencing what he'd put Sarah through, had convinced Emma that redemption was possible even for those who'd caused terrible harm. The Foundation's success in defending teachers had attracted national attention and significant funding from philanthropists who understood the connection between teacher retention and educational quality. What had started as Sarah's personal mission had become a movement, with similar organizations springing up in other states and countries. But Sarah remained focused on individual cases, understanding that policy change meant nothing without real protection for the teachers on the front lines of these battles. Each case was personal, each victory meaningful, each teacher saved from harassment, a validation of everything she'd endured at Westfield. As she drove home to prepare for the trip to Texas, Sarah thought about the young teacher facing threats and intimidation from powerful parents who believed their wealth granted them license to destroy anyone who challenged their children's privilege. 5 years ago, that teacher would have faced the same isolation and confusion Sarah had experienced, forced to navigate a hostile system without support or guidance. Now, within hours of reaching out for help, she'd have experienced legal advocates, media support, and a network of educators who'd faced similar battles and emerged victorious. The Foundation had created what Sarah wished had existed during her darkest days at Westfield, proof that teachers didn't have to face harassment alone. The next morning, Sarah boarded a flight to Austin with a briefcase full of legal documents and a phone loaded with contacts built over years of fighting similar battles. But she also carried something more valuable, the knowledge that her experience at Westfield High School had meaning beyond her own vindication. Every teacher the Foundation helped, every harassment campaign they stopped, every policy they changed, represented a victory not just for individual educators, but for the principle that wealth and influence couldn't override basic human decency and professional respect. And somewhere in Colorado, a young man who'd once planned to force her to crawl was spending his evening researching legal precedents that would protect another teacher from the kind of abuse he'd once inflicted. The circle of redemption was complete, but the work of justice continued. The plane lifted off into the Colorado sunset, carrying Sarah toward another battle in a war she'd never planned to fight, but had come to understand was the most important work of her life. Behind her, the mountains that had witnessed her transformation from broken teacher to national advocate glowed in the fading light, silent guardians of a story that proved even the most entrenched systems of privilege could be challenged by someone with enough courage to stand up and refuse to be silenced. In her laptop bag was a printed copy of the Teacher Protection Act, legislation that would protect thousands of educators from the harassment she'd endured. On her phone were text messages from Jake, Derek, and dozens of other allies who joined her crusade against institutional bullying. But most importantly, In her heart was the unshakable conviction that had carried her through every battle since that first day at Westfield High School, that right would ultimately triumph over might, that truth would overcome influence, and that sometimes the most important victories were won by those who simply refused to give up. The fight continued, but Sarah Mitchell was no longer fighting alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.